I think Artemis has finished dismantling the room, so the discussion is about Christopher Alexander and Nature of Order. So, for those who don't know, so he was born in Vienna, but one of his parents was Jewish, and so after Anschluss in 1938, moved to Britain, quite sensibly. So he grew up in the UK, really, he was about 2. He was educated at Cambridge, Harvard, and MIT. He taught at Berkeley for a very, very long time. And he just passed away just quite recently. And there were obituaries about him in all the major newspapers and all the architectural press. So who cares? I mean, lots of people hang around and say clever things. So I could say he's one of the leading critics of both the theory, but especially the practice, the actual built form of post-war architectural mainstream. There are a lot of those. I think he's one of the earlier ones. And he was very influential. I think if you look at any urban design or architectural movement that is not in the corporate mainstream post-1945, they will all be very aware of Christopher Alexander and very often be inspired by some of his work. So things like the new urbanism and so forth, they borrowed heavily from his earlier work. Now, the point I'd like to make before we get into the details is you don't have to agree with everything that Christopher Alexander says or has said or wrote to think he's interesting. I think he's one of those characters that was quite pugnacious and I think sometimes even a bit adversarial to the mainstream, a bit of a contrarian. And so sometimes some of the things he said or did were a little bit quirky, nothing offensive, but a little bit quirky. But he's very, very interesting because of the way he looked at architecture and built space, I think, because of the reasons he looked at architecture and built space. So, and the approach that he took to analysis. So it's much more empirical in his work and much more given to Conciliate, so I'll talk about these things, than most theoreticians. Most design theoreticians just write some stuff down and say, this is the way it is. And they may give you 1 or 2 examples, but they don't really justify it in a way that an engineer or even a social scientist would find satisfying. They don't offer a lot of data. He did. And also, he was very interested in the humane side of design. Basically, is it biophilic? Does it make people feel good? Is it something that makes you happy? And that's something that, was considered kind of a risible consideration by most people in most fields after World War II. It was very technocratic, right? People like it. Who cares? What do they know, right? So his uppermost goal was to build in a way that created a feeling of satisfaction and contentment. So that already makes him a bit of an oddity, because the idea of art certainly post World War I, but I would say post the 1890s is the idea of rupture or questioning, not idea of feeling satisfied or content. And so he wrote about this a lot, and it's not an obvious thing. I think a lot of people, I was speaking to someone about this who's not an art historian or that involved in design history and so forth, and they said, well, doesn't everyone do that? You obviously haven't paid attention. No, that's the opposite of what most people do. I mentioned Conciliate. So Conciliate, this is the dictionary definition, is the idea that you can borrow methodologies and whether they are hard technology and numerical methodologies, or even just approaches to analysis from a number of different fields and bring them together to reach a more solidly based conclusion. So he studied architecture, but studied also maths a lot. That's why he really started as a maths guy. Transportation theory. He did a lot of computer science. I think a lot of IT people, some of the design of languages and meta-languages borrow from some of his work. He was one of the world experts on vernacular building and the culture of building in all kinds of societies. Anthropology, design systems, blah, blah, blah. And again, that's not something you can say of most design theoreticians. Most design theoreticians went to studied art history or went to a design school, they got a degree, and so they're experts, but they really haven't studied any of the other fields that could impact on that. We'll talk about some of the evidence of empiricism in his work, but I think one of the best ways to see how dedicated Alexander was to getting things right and basing them on data and evidence is the fact that he constantly revises his own work. His most influential work, his most best-selling book, this one, was published in 1977. And I think most people that publish a book, I think it still sells roughly like 30,000 copies a year. That's it. They just spend the rest of their life defending how, the fact that it's flawless and perfect and wonderful and everybody must buy it. They don't spend years revising it, rewriting it, and bring out lots of other books. And it's a very unique quality that he had. So some exhibits in the case of why we should care about Christopher Alexander, roughly in chronological order. So one of the things that really endeared me to Mr. Alexander, long after I was familiar with his work and interested in his work, but I started actually looking at his life history, mostly for this presentation, was that we share something. From a very early age, he was fascinated by the idea of beauty, which I think a lot of people that are aesthetic are. But specifically as to whether there was some kind of information or formula or objective set of data that you could apply to beauty as opposed to just say, I like that, I don't like that. Okay, you have a different opinion, great. Was there something deeper and more complex, but also more reproducible in that? And so when he was at Cambridge, and he was a scholarship student, he was not well off. His parents, basically had to leave everything behind when they moved to the UK. They weren't rich people. But he spent his own money to hire an aesthetics professor as a tutor to sort of just to see whether he could get better understanding of the field of aesthetics. It didn't work out for reasons I think you'll be familiar with if you saw my last presentation. But the fact that he did that I think is extraordinary. I think that, and now I'm referring to some of the topics that we covered in the presentation I did a few months ago, the one about the potential aspects of objectivity in aesthetics. He pursued a sort of classical, humane concept of beauty as opposed to a romantic or individualist concept of beauty. And here are a couple of quotes, which I think are, again, very good at illustrating his way of thinking. He felt that as an architect or as a designer, everything around us either raises our spirits a little bit or doesn't. And the job of a designer is for things to work, obviously, so a building shouldn't fall about your ears, and they should be affordable, but they should also do this. They should lift your spirits a little bit. That runs contrary to, I think, the mainstream concept of what all of that should do, especially in the practice, not so much in the theory, but in the practice. And my favorite quote about his approach to design is that he wants to make a building which is like a smile on a person's face, not just bring a smile to a person's face, but like a smile. And if there's anyone in your life that you care about, and they genuinely smile at you, you know what that effect feels like, right? Especially if it's a child or someone who's maybe, in a difficult situation, and they smile at you. He wanted the building to feel like that. So, very, very quickly, cover some of the ground that we covered a few months ago about different views of beauty. There are lots of theories, but the two main ones are the classical theory, which is canonical, i.e. there are rules to it, however difficult they may be to uncover. They're objective rules, they're universal, they're not dependent too much on where you come from or what your name is or how old you are, and they apply to large numbers of people, so they're collective. The more contemporary, I think, romanticist view of beauty is aesthetic beauty, which beauty is contingent. It depends on your background, it depends on what you've learned, what you've been taught. It's subjective. It's cultural, so we may find something beautiful that other people find very, very, very ugly. And it's very individualist, it's very personal. And so they both have, I think, a role in modern life. And so this is an example of something that is rule-based and reproducible. And this is a painting by Roth, which has the plum colors. I searched for a while to find a Roth painting because he painted in all kinds of colors. And that's much more unique. And in a very neutral sense of the word, it's arbitrary. It's Roth's view of what is beautiful. He's not trying to tell us that we should think it's beautiful. It's what he thought was, or at least valid or interesting. Now, I mentioned Hutcheson before in relation to Alexander. You might remember from the presentation, Francis Hutcheson was a 17th century philosopher, and I think probably one of the best commentators on this fusion of the different ideas of beauty and aesthetics. And he wrote a lot, so you can't really knock it down to one sentence, but one sentence that recurs was uniformity within variety. So if you look at a wood, it's not symmetrical, it's not perfectly geometric, right? It's higgledy-piggledy. One flower is here, one tree is there, and each flower is slightly different from the next, so are the trees. But there's a lot of repetition, right? They're not completely random. They don't have a triangular tree and then next to it you have a tree that's atomized and so forth. And the same is true of most architecture created through most of the time, is that it's got lots of different, sometimes contrasting elements and details. And these vary from building to building, from time to time, from place to place. But there's some recurring aspects, doorways tend to be clearly marked and then have some kind of hierarchy of structures and messages and so forth. And you might remember the conclusion that was my conclusion, my opinion, which I think Alexander shared, that uniformity within variety in a neuroadaptive sense balances the need that we have for stimuli to the sympathetic system, especially to the parasympathetic system. And so the beauty can be defined in lots of ways, but essentially it's something that mostly, not only, but mostly reassures and delights us. And there's a great deal of validity to challenging and questioning, but perhaps it's not right to conflate it and use the same word. It's something else. It's not beauty. So those are the quotes again. So that's his background. That's where he comes from. This is his first major work. When he was 26, he published his dissertation. In '63, it became a book, short book. It was very well received. The American Institute of Architects basically created the prize for research, because usually they only give prizes for buildings or designs of buildings. So they created that so that they could give him this prize, and they've been running it since, because it's just a research project. It says nothing about a specific building. And it's quite complex. I haven't read it. I've read, sort of synopses of it. But it basically used set theory, which was very popular at the time, to come up with an algorithm that would allow you to reduce the number of design criteria based on how strongly they're interrelated with each other, so that you could produce a hierarchical decision tree. And this is a hyper-simplified one. Imagine you are designing a kettle, you want it to work, you want it to be affordable. So that breaks down into a number of other subcategories and so on and so forth. And so you may have 21 design things. You take all these boxes, you meet these criteria, and you have a good kettle. And it's a lot more complex than that, believe me, but that's the kind of thought. The idea is to reduce complexity to where it is tractable, while taking into account design criteria. So, very high profile. Again, I think most people would have just settled with that and just riffed on that for the rest of their career. But that wasn't him. Before the book was published and after the dissertation, he went off to India. He was just interested in Indian culture. He was a bit of a, I guess you could call it a little bit of an alternative guy. And he went to live in a village in Gujarat, and he used some of the methodology that he developed for his dissertation to study the patterns of usage of the town and the buildings, and also the patterns of construction, okay? And that's fine. And so he does that for a bit of time. Then he goes back to Harvard. Someone in the government of Gujarat found out that he created these diagrams and got in touch with him, because the government was going to create a new dam, was going to flood that village, and so they needed to build a new one where they moved all these people to a safe location. And they thought, well, you can help us design it. And because he was very interested in doing things evidence-based, he thought, I could do this very badly, kind of pseudo-anthropologist. I've parachuted in for a few weeks, and now I know everything about how people in Gujarat live, and I designed their village for them, right? And he didn't do that. Now, if any of you have ever met an architect or went to architecture school or anything like that, there's 1 in 10 million architects at that age that would have the humility to say, I don't know enough to do this, so I'm going to screw it up. So I refuse to do it, right? Right, especially, right? Absolutely. Same with economists, but especially architects. Like, yeah, I'm a genius, right? I'm going to make the best damn village I've ever seen. So he refused to do it. He hated himself. He says, I hated myself for it, but I couldn't do it. But what he took away from that is that, okay, maybe I should know enough to do that next time somebody asks me. So he spent quite a bit of time while the book was being edited studying the anthropology of vernacular architecture. Why do they have this kind of shape in one place and a different shape? Why is the door here in one culture? And he was looking at vernacular architecture the way they intended it in the 60s and the 50s, which was usually architecture of what they used to call primitive people. So not rich people, not houses in Westchester County, but tribes and that sort of thing. And it occurred to him that there were clearly rules at work everywhere. It wasn't just what was available in terms of materialism, that's important, but there were rules that were being followed, and there weren't rules in the sense that there were legal requirements. No one's going to arrest you if you built your roof in a different way. But they had arrived at these patterns over a period of time. And so he thought, okay, this is interesting, and also, if we have to discover what these are, when we build something, we have to involve the users, from day one, which again is something that people give lip service to, but they don't really do. And he came up with this phrase, which, as you can see, obviously endeared him to the architectural profession. So most of the wonderful places in the world were not made by architects; they were made by people. None of these buildings were designed by a high-ranking or even an architect. And the way I've done a little bit of research in this type of building arrangement. It's actually quite an interesting set of mathematical properties to it. But the people that didn't have these formulas down. They just had a number of rules, like you obviously can't build your house sticking in front of mine, so because you can't get out. There's simple things, but also they angle that to each other, and doors shouldn't be right in front of, so that we both have the door open. We can't see through two houses, right? Privacy and so on. And so it generates the shape almost naturally. And so in 1965, he wrote a book basically saying, the book that got the prize in 1961, 1963, it's wrong if you're talking about cities and neighborhoods and urban design. A city is not a tree. These requirements are not purely hierarchical, they interact. So if these requirements were like this is set theory, they were all nested within each other, then you could draw a pretty decent tree. And you can draw a tree with some overlap, but in reality, some of these relationships are too complex to conceptualize in this way. And so he believed, and he said this in this piece of work, that both in terms of the layout, the organization, the design of built environment, but also the decision-making, and in his opinion, the actual political and administrative ruling of a built environment, i.e. a city or a neighborhood, should not be centralized, it should not be decentralized, it should be distributed. Now, how you run a city on a distributed government system, I don't know. I don't think anyone's ever found out, so it never happened. But certainly, if you look at street patterns, right, this kind of street pattern consumes a lot more petrol. It's a nightmare if everybody, right? If everybody that goes from here to here has to go to the middle and come back out, that wouldn't work, right? And this also is kind of waste. So if you have a pattern like that, it works better. So that was the idea. I've got a lot of slides. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but this approach of trying to meet different requirements without necessarily saying this one comes before this one and this one comes before that one has some interesting repercussions, even if you're looking at just two requirements, which is trying to not have too intensive ground coverage, so you have some trees, but also people be able to move from one place to another in a way that is varied. So in a building this size, built like this, you can go up and down, not this way, not that way, which, for instance, in a security or safety issues, is problematic, right? If there's a fire, the stairs better be fireproof, right? But also, it creates all kinds of issues that, you're never going to go outside to see one of your neighbors, ever, right? And so he put a lot of different, and so his view was, for instance, that a medium rise, medium coverage pattern, on average, for residential worked better for a number of reasons. I'm sorry that I'm really glossing over a lot of these things. I mean, you could make a presentation out of just this one slide and the work that he did for it, but I wanted to give you a bit of an overview. Having done a lot of this work, he actually did get involved in some builds. And like the one in Peru was interesting because not only did they move, he and his team moved to this place in Peru, but they actually did some of the work that the people there did. So if a guy was a carpenter, they kind of helped him. They followed him around and did some of the work. And so the idea was to really get into what these people were living, their life experience, and how they would design. And they designed it and built it together. All of this led to 3 books, which were published in a funny order. The order in which you should read them is this one. You can see they were published in the opposite order. The most influential is A Pattern Language, which is this book. And I'm going to pass it around if you want to take a look at it. It's a quirky book. The way the illustrations are done and the way he writes about things is halfway between Whole Earth Catalog, which, by the way, was inspired by his work, and very hippie-ish, and some quite technical stuff in there as well. And the idea was that he, after years of observation and study, he identified 253 patterns, which he thought were recurrent at the level of organizing a whole area, a region, a town, a neighborhood, a street or square, a building or a room. Okay? And the idea was that you had to try to implement as many of these as possible to generate a lived environment, a built environment that was conducive to people enjoying it and having it working well for them. You'd be glad to know I won't go through 253 of them. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. Number 4, agricultural valleys. Now, if you'll see, the article, each chapter has a fair amount of explanation, and sometimes they often refer to papers and research. So it's not just aphorisms, you should do this because I'm Christopher Alexander, I'm clever, you should do this. So it explains it better than that. But the basic idea of this pattern, for instance, is that the areas at the bottom of valleys or near rivers should be privileged for agricultural or open use, and you should try and build away from them, so either upslope or away from the rivers, among other things that don't get flooded as much. When agricultural land gets flooded, not always ideal, but it's better than if a house or a neighborhood gets flooded. And so, this is something that seems, nowadays in planning is universally applied, and I can tell you that, well, actually, not in this country so much, but but there was a time when this wasn't universally applied, and people did find out that they were ruining a lot of agricultural land that was easily reachable land at a reasonable slope, and so on and so forth. Identifiable neighborhood. So this again an idea that's kind of very widely, certainly amongst new urbanists, but I would say almost all planners now, they think that okay, if you have a large area that's not a village, it's a good idea to subdivide it conceptually, administratively, potentially, and certainly in terms of build space, into subunits that have some cohesion, where the main roads are on the outside of the unit, so you can reach all the different ones easily, but they're not sort of penetrating that bit, and that have a certain size. Now people talk about a 5-minute walk diameter. This was his approximation, so that kind of size. That's an example of another pattern. Another pattern is the idea that we should have public outdoor room. I took this picture. I picked this specifically because whereas this place and the one I showed you of the other town in Italy, these are relatively famous, beautiful places, right? So you say, okay, taking your examples from really well-known, lovely places, we can't all build like that. This is a very ordinary town in Portugal that no one that doesn't live next to it has ever heard of. It's not a famous tourist place, okay? But it has a lot of the characteristics that he was talking about. It's like a room. It's mostly enclosed. It's not just a big open plaza, windswept and so forth. It's mixed use. You can actually get there by car. So, if you don't feel like walking for 500 yards, or you can't, because some people can't, you can get there. But it's not car dominated. It's not just a big highway, huge parking lot. It has mixed, it has houses, it has shops, it has cafes. And he thought, having something like that in every neighborhood at a certain scale is not just a nice thing to have because it looks cute. It makes your life better. It means that you can spend some time around your neighbors or passers-by or visitors in a way that is socially conducive. Another pattern language. So remember, they go all the way down to shapes of rooms, right? And in retrospect, I should have picked patterns that are more based on individual homes, because it's something that we're all familiar with, right? We all have a place to live in, hopefully, and we've lived in houses. None of us, I think, has designed a whole neighborhood, but we maybe decided we wanted this house rather than that house, or maybe done some work on our house. But sorry, so this is the lowest gradient one that I've done. Roofs. You think a roof, it's kind of a matter of personal choice. I like it like this, you like it like that, and you found that no. There's lots of research and lots of great reasons to think that a roof plays a psychological role, not just a structural role to keep the rain out. And it should be roofy, i.e. it should have a slope. And it shouldn't be just kind of, this roof, according to him, would be a very, very bad roof. It just kind of melts into nothing, it's barely noticeable, it's just there. This one's got a better pitch, but it's not strongly marked. And it doesn't have much of an overhang. One of the things a roof should do is overhang, so it doesn't rain down your building. It's actually from a purely practical point of view makes a lot of sense. And he also felt that as you get close to the entrance, the roof should be lower, or there should be another roof as you have in this case. So in his view, there was an objective difference between this roof design, which is appalling, this one, which is trying but doesn't quite get it, and this one, which, whether you like the house per se, statistically or not, is a good roof. So that was the idea. And this book, like I say, has been tremendously influential. I would say if you buy it or borrow it or take it out from the library, don't do what I did. Don't start from, how should we design, the south of England. Start from the back. He did it in diminishing order of size, but since none of us, again, are the prime minister or the minister for the environment, start from the back. Start from, things, a room should have windows like this, or there should be different types of chairs, and blah, blah, blah. And, it's just quite interesting. Again, you don't have to agree with everything or do everything. I disagree with some of his patterns or some of his observations, but it was quite a useful piece of work. But he wasn't happy with that because as time went on, he noticed that there were lots of architects and planners that he met, that he worked with, that were genuinely trying to use as many of his patterns as possible, within the constraints of real life and real world and what the client wants and what's allowed, right, by the zoning regulations, the building regulations, and even some of the work that he did, because obviously he built, he designed and built a number of buildings. He felt that, following these patterns created buildings and streets, and in some cases, by this point, you were having even some neighborhoods that were beginning to take his theories into account. They were very usable. People liked them, but he felt they did not have. That's almost a straight quote. They rarely achieved the elegance of long-established architectural idioms, and this really got him into trouble because he very often refers to vernacular and traditional architectural shapes. And so a lot of contemporary architects felt that he was regressive, that he was reactionary. He was saying that we should all build buildings like they did in the old days. I do personally, but he didn't. He didn't. Like he said, no, let's build completely new buildings, different buildings, as long as they're as satisfying as those, right? So if we can distill some of the things that made those buildings in lots of different countries, in lots of different periods and in cultures, instinctively, obviously satisfying, then, knock yourself out. We don't have to build them, but the label kind of stuff. And so he thought they don't have that kind of sense of rightness, of wholeness. And I'll explain later what he meant by wholeness. And so he went back to the drawing board and he wrote 4 books, 2,300 plus pages. I don't think anyone, I think there's Nikos Salingaros, who's probably his main follower and an architect and designer, has written some very good books. Maybe he's read it all. I don't think anyone else has read it all. But the one that I think that, the title of all the books together is The Nature of Order, an essay on the art of building the nature of the universe. And so what he was trying to do, and in this he was partly inspired by some advances in applied mathematics in the 80s and 90s, to create a generative grammar for building. And what we mean by a generative grammar is, imagine you're talking about language, okay, in philology. In a language, you have a bunch of nouns, you have some rules, right? The verb goes here, then you conjugate it, you have adjectives. You can't just have a sentence made of lots and lots of adjectives. I mean, you can do that, but you won't be very successful in communicating. So typically, you want at least a verb and a subject, and so on and so forth. But then what you can write with those words and those rules is, it's infinitely varied, right? But you generate, with this relatively simple set of rules, you can generate a lot. And the idea was that the reason that a lot of work, including work that he had inspired, didn't really fit and didn't really create the sense of natural elegance was that he had described things that he observed in successful built space. He was describing the symptoms, he wasn't examining the causes. And the causes are, he felt, was a morphology that is innate to nature, the universe. And if there is a morphology that is innate to nature and the universe, complex though it may be, that's what we're used to. That's what we're evolved to like. Most people don't have to be taught that flowers or a tree in summer is beautiful. We just kind of perceive that because since we were sort of hairless monkeys in the savannah, that's what we've been used to. And so there is a great deal of research, most of it post-Alexander, suggesting that a lot of the things that people tend to like, and again, It's not a black and white thing, it's not like we must all like this thing, but people tend to like certain aspects, like, they like open space, but with some kind of enclosure, at least on one side, and so on and so forth, are evolutionarily derived, right? So they're neuroadaptive. And he felt if there is an underlying order or organization of morphologies in the universe, built space that mirrors that to some degree is naturally felt to be satisfying, elegant. It's like a smile on someone's face. And so you remember Mandelbrot, his Mandelbrot sets and fractals. Now, it's like the patterns he identified were mostly not fractals. I only mention fractals because it's something that I think most people, including myself, who are not mathematicians, have some awareness of. So this is a type of cauliflower, as you know. That's a section of a shell, so on and so forth. That's a purely, I think, invented thing. But the point is that the rules that make this kind of shape are 3 or 4. They're really, really simple rules. Again, it's a really complex shape. It has variety, but there's also a recognizable pattern, like Hutchison would have said, right? It's not random. It's not just noise. There's more to that than noise, but it's not perfectly predictable. It kind of tilts that way, and if you buy 3 of these, they'll never be identical, right? Like snowflakes. Now, the concept of fractals at its most basic is the repetition of the same shape or the same rules at different scales, okay? And now when you do fractals in a laboratory, you do perfect fractals. In real life, there are all kinds of constraints. There's a mountain there, a valley here, blah, blah, blah. So we don't develop pure fractals. But there's definitely evidence of fractality. This is a temple in India, okay? In the sense that the shapes, this shape is repeated in the smaller parts, and lots of elements, the larger, there are the 3 or 4 scales at which they're repeated. In a city, this is a plan of Paris, I think, and this is the plan of the open spaces, the spaces that you can traverse, that a bird could fly across without smacking against something. You have the Seine, right? Then you have some of the major roads, then the smaller roads, the subsidiary roads, and so on. And that develops kind of naturally, right? You don't have, but it's possible, especially, with modern technology, for an engineer to plan something that says, okay, for a large area, we won't have that, okay, that's fine, but it has repercussions. It has repercussions on how trafficable the place is, how walkable it is, how it feels to be in it, whether we want to hang around that part of town or sometimes, always, never. So that was part of the things he identified. So if you take a Lipinski triangle, that's one that was common in all these spaces. So with a right triangle, then it's 3, and so on and so forth, right? And his view was that some of these shapes are mirrored. They're not perfectly reproduced, but they're mirrored in a lot of traditional architecture and traditional design. And that may be a reason why we tend to look at it and find a certain sense of rightness about it. So his point of view, and this is slightly metaphysical, is that the order of space is prior to the question of function, because the function stems from the order. You cannot create a function, a useful, intelligent, non-perverse function that is outside of reality and what works in the universe. And so the shape is also part of that. So they have to go together. You can't say, I'll come up with a function that disregards the natural morphology of reality. You can make this case obviously psychologically. You can come up with an ideology that goes against who we are as human beings. It typically doesn't pay off very well because. And so he came up with this idea of a generative grammar. A relatively basic, very relatively basic set of naturally arising dynamics which work with and also against each other. They're often conflictual, right? One thing pushes you one direction, another requirement pushes you another direction. That's how it happens in nature, right? For some things, it's good to be a very large animal, but if you're a very large animal, it's just difficult to dissipate heat. You need a lot of food, and so on and so forth. So there's conflicting demands. That happens also in the generative grammar. And he thought he identified 15 properties. And I'll warn you, they're labeled in a very pithy way. So without explanation, they look a little bit kind of arbitrary. But these properties, if you take these into consideration, you are designing your building in the way that the universe works, in the way that the shape of snowflakes works. And they're not like that randomly. They work like that because of physics and chemistry and thermodynamics. And so similarly, you can do the same with buildings. And so these are the 15 properties. Again, I don't want to keep you here till 3 o'clock in the morning tomorrow, so I won't talk about all of them or explain them in very great detail because they are quite deep. So you look at something like levels of scale, is the idea that scale should be repeated at more than one level. So essentially, if you have one big giant wall, that doesn't reproduce anything that we find in nature, or let's say nurturing nature. Maybe like a huge vast salt flat is like that, but everything dies in a huge vast salt flat. You put that, we grew up in dappled shade, basically with trees and grass and so forth. And those got lots of different types of scale. A tree is a typical example, right? It's a big tree, and it's got smaller branches and smaller and smaller and smaller twigs, and they're repeated. It's a pseudo-fractal. So that's the idea of levels of scale, and so on and so forth. I'll give some examples. So one of the patterns you talk about is strong centers. And the idea is that to tie together a building or an area, you need some kind of focus. It can't be just kind of random. It's disorienting. And so the center can be an empty space, and that's a very famous building in Tunisia, the Mosque of Kariouan. It's a very well-defined space. It's not completely, you can see there are arcades, so it's permeable to the eye, to the person. It also has secondary foci, these big towers, smaller one and a big one. So there's this sense of centeredness. But in a very small building like these traditional houses, there's a small place in Puglia, really it's only a tiny bit of Puglia, where they built these houses, and it's become, I think, quite famous, certainly in Italy, but I think in most places, because they're so unique. And in his view, the center was this bit here, from which the whole roof seems to kind of originate, right? It's clearly a focus. You can't look at this building without your eye kind of going to that little bubble at the top. And so he felt that this big visual focus organized our thoughts, both as an inhabitant and as a designer, for how to develop this. The other one is another property he talks about is alternating repetition. Sometimes you need big buildings. If you got a big bank or a big office or a factory, you need a big building, and a big building needs a lot of windows. Now you can just repeat the same identical window over and over and over and over and over. But the way he explained that was collapsible information. It's you're not adding anything more. It's just a lot of the same thing. And so his view was that there should be some contrast in the repetition. So this is also a building that has a lot of windows, and it's used for the same purpose as this other building. It's of a different period, of a different time. But there is a variation between these windows and these, because these are framed by columns, and the columns are piers or columns. And then they're different at each floor, so there's variation along both axes. And this, which is many neoclassical buildings don't do, but this one does, is the pediment is triangular and round, and triangular and round, and triangular. And so the idea was that because you do need to repeat elements in a building, you do, right? You can't just have one window in the building that size or one gigantic window. It helps if that repetition is somehow punctuated, essentially. Local symmetries, that's another one that at the beginning it kind of takes a while to understand what he's talking about. So the idea is that symmetry, again, is something that helps us divide and understand and conceptualize. But this building has one symmetry along this axis, and then it just repeats endlessly, okay? St. Paul's has lots of symmetries, and they're local in the sense that they're not absolute symmetries, right? So along this axis, it's not symmetrical. This bit is longer than the bit at the back. You can't see it there, but you'll remember. But this section is symmetrical. This is obviously, the facade is symmetrical. The whole building is symmetrical there. This has got radial symmetry. These are elements individually. So the idea, I guess, is tied to the idea of scale at different levels. It's not just one big symmetry, but lots of symmetries nested into each other. And so if I could just summarize, and these are more my words than his words, so apologies if I'm misrepresenting Mr. Alexander, but nature manifests some morphologies which seem to be repeated. They're fairly universal. They work on many different scales, and they interact, and they're regular. And so the result of that, because they're so complex and they interact, is very, very complex. Complex to the point where it's almost chaotically generated, but it's not arbitrary or random. And there's a difference, both mathematically and I think conceptually. So order is not simple. A bleak, simple thing is not ordered. Or rather, is an order at such a simplistic, collapsed scale that it's not satisfying. maybe you could say it's too easy, to make it orderly by, it's a little bit like the old...
It's not engaging.
It's the old thing that, if you were political, you could say the idea of disorder being too simple is a bit like when Seneca said they make of the Romans conquering, saying they make a desert and call it peace. Like it's easy to keep the peace if you kill everybody. Proper peace, or what we would interpret as peace is people living peacefully together, not like I kill everybody, but it's peace. So similarly, order should not be bleak or sparse. Order is complex. We are adapted to recognize this complexity and to find it satisfactory. So in some way, it should be mirrored in what we design, especially large things. Like if you're designing a social cellar, okay, fine, make it simple. I don't care. It's me. But if you're talking about a building or a neighborhood or a street, it's a very large thing, which people are forced to see, by the way, if they live there or near there. And so it should have some of these characteristics. And that appreciation of order, this complex, generative order, emergent order, is what you could say that's what we perceive as beauty, especially in large, complex settings. So a tree is an example of natural order, and this could say this is a Capitoline building in Rome. Could be an example of man-made order, and I would argue this is neither order nor, obviously not natural. This is man-made. Now, some critiques of Alexander. First of all, he took a very highly moralistic tone, and you'll see that in this discussion he had with another architect. He says a moral obligation to implement these properties. Well, I think in our day, to tell somebody, look, you have to do this, or not like I do it, but in your own way, but you have to do it, otherwise you're breaking some kind of moral code. In social sciences, we tend to avoid that kind of talk. It's not done. And so I think, he's a bit like Puget and Morris. I think he argued it with lots more evidence. Puget just said stuff. In my opinion, you should do this. Okay, thank you. But he's a lot deeper than that. But he has the same tone. That everyone that does something different, he's just a bad person or perverse. And that's I think that in some ways didn't help him. The other one is that vernacular buildings were a huge influence on him, and so people kind of simplistically said, oh, so we should just build like little old houses like they did, in the Middle Ages. How do we build like bridges spanning like large areas? And I think it's a bit unfair, but this idea that he was regressive is a very common critique. And just to see just how pugnacious and easily riled he was, there's an infamous debate that he had in 1982 with Peter Eisenman, who was not a very famous architect, but a fairly well-known architect, and I think a well-known architectural critic. Alexander has kind of lost it and became rude and used rude words to him, which you don't do in a debate in a university between two professors. It tends to. Okay, so what Alexander says, what I'm quoting, that's in green, and Azimut is in that nice orange there. So Azimut is saying, look, postmodern structuralism. I won't bother you with the definition of postmodern structuralism. Something happened there.
Yes.
That's not postmodern structuralism, although it looks a little bit like that.
I'm hoping I won't actually have to reboot.
We're now observing the background
the chaos
universe.
Yeah.
Which is also
the back of the bar.
It's been doing this recently, and I don't know why. The only thing I can think of is to restart the computer.
Has anyone seen the buildings, the huge tower blocks on the way to Finsbury Park, or the modern tower blocks on Victoria Bridge Road?
Yes.
My father was involved with the construction of those, for which he deeply apologises. Because they're bloody awful.
Right.
They have been utterly a total failure. They were built with the idea of in Croatia the first block of flats was ever built, and it was an idea of a reactionary against small houses.
Okay. So what happens? So Eisenman says, look, postmodern structuralism also challenges some of the simplifications of early modernism, and so they're saying similar things to you. And he makes a very important point. He says, look, I don't care what they write on these slightly obscure, dense pieces of paper. Look at their buildings. And if you tell me that, I'm also seeking balance and beauty and complexity, but what you're building, there's a lot of blank walls or just sheets of glass, as far as I can see, that's nonsense. So let's look at the actual building. So that already starts being a little bit confrontational. And so he says, look, let's talk about a building we both like, everybody likes, Chartres Cathedral. And interestingly, Eisenman says, actually, I find Chartres Cathedral boring. I went to Chartres, I went to the restaurant, I didn't go inside the cathedral. Once you've seen one Gothic cathedral, you've seen them all. So, he's taking, I think, also quite a strong ideological, maybe doctrinaire view of things. And so he's like, Alexander says, okay, it basically implies you're just crazy, you're sick. I mean, who doesn't like Chartres Cathedral? I can give you lots of reasons why people like it, but okay, I'm surprised. So they finally find a building they both like, which is Palazzo Vecchio by Palladio. And they say things about it. And interestingly, what Azimut says is that what he finds is that it's not such an emotional building, it's more of an intellectual building. And this is a direct quote, this is not a typology of sameness or wholeness. It's a typology of differences. It's a typology which transgresses wholeness and contaminates it. First of all, I don't see where he sees that, personally. I see no breaks, no contamination, no differences that are breaks with. There's innovation, there's change, we all use the same language, or we construct different sentences, but it's not gobbledygook. But anyway, he likes it because of that reason. And then he goes on to say, he went to Grotto, and there is a town hall by Raphael Moineo, and what he really liked was the fact that the columns are really, really, really thin and reedy, and that overhang is very, very high, so it doesn't do what an overhang is supposed to do, which is shade a lot of the building or protect you from rain, because if there's any wind at all, given the overhang is that high, you will get wet down here. And the columns look wrong, because of things. So he said, I like that. I like that sense of separation and fragility, and that's not sort of somehow the right proportions. And that's what says. So you're trying to produce an effect of disharmony on purpose. He says, okay, so I'm really angry. So that's when he loses this. I feel incredibly angry because he's fucking up the world. He's making bad things and making people feel bad. Why is he building buildings? And I mean, he's got a very long quote, but what he essentially keeps saying is, do you think people are not alienated enough? That people are not unsettled enough? That people are so, everything is great, everything is wonderful, I have no sorrows or problems in my life. Please bring them into my life with, really ugly building. Like, what planet do you live on? So, but, he got really, really heated up. And so, at one point he said, that Eisenman was screwing things up. Anyway. So that's why, one of the reasons I think he became controversial, even though I think a lot of his ideas, whether you agree with all of them or not, I think are interesting and worth studying and worth knowing about. But he had this chart. This is Mr. Eisenman, and I'm not inviting you to judge these buildings of his, or I'm going to show you a few buildings, or Alexander as good or bad, or you like him or don't like him, though you will, obviously, because you have your own views. But I just point out how they say rub up against some of the patterns that Alexander talked about. So this is a house by Azimut. It doesn't have a center. It's not clear. In fact, it's not clear where the front door is. Maybe on the other side. The boundaries are fading. They're not thick boundaries. Talk about thick boundaries. They're really kind of elide almost into the surroundings. There is no symmetry, obviously, and there is an inner tension. There isn't a sense of like it's all one thing. They're funny angles at each other, and windows where maybe a wall should be. So it certainly doesn't conform to, you may not like it, but it doesn't conform to something Alexander liked or thought was good. There's another Azimut building. There's one scale, essentially. I mean, there's a little bit of detail with different stones and glass, but basically it's just one large object. It's not really broken up. It's got a very funky shape, which is, ultra expensive. But there's no obvious center. The boundaries, again, are a bit fading. The shape is not very definite, and there are no symmetries at any scale. Again, no center, too smooth. He talked a lot about roughness. His point was that nothing is smooth. If you get a microscope and you go closer to this is actually quite rough. And so the idea was that a small thing can be smooth, but if you have a huge thing and it's so smooth, there should be some contrast, some depth to it. And it's separate. It's very separate from its environment. I'm not sure what Azimut was doing here. It's obviously not a building. But it's a lot of very similar concrete blocks. I think as a tank. So a person would be about this big. Yeah. So a person would be about this tall.
That's right.
So
It's just the Holocaust.
okay. Which again, because when we think of the Holocaust, we have all these happy thoughts, right? No, right? I mean, I think we realize that the Holocaust is possibly the worst single process in history, you know, and the way he thought it made sense to memorialize it is this way, and, you know, obviously a lot of people agreed with him, you know, other people may have taken a different view, but anyway, so it's very single, it doesn't have lots of scales and so forth. So Alexander would have been against this kind of thing, and Azimut, for different reasons, liked it, because it was, you know, this is kind of angsty, I mean, right, and the Holocaust is a terrible thing, so I guess he was trying to communicate that, you know, I don't know, all the you know, the uncounted dead, you know, just you know, this horrible thing that happened, and you know, I guess maybe that mirrors that. I don't know. That's more Eisenman and more. What about Christopher Alexander? What did he build?
Okay.
I don't think he was a great architect personally. I don't find his buildings that satisfying. But what I find them is that they're humane. Again, I think they more follow the patterns that his later theory. They're not very beautiful, but they don't make me feel like running away screaming, unlike Azimut. So this is one of the very early things. It's a house you built for some rich person in California. Every quirky architect, the first few things they build is some person who's as nutty as they are says, "Build me a house. I've got money. It doesn't matter." Right? So that's how it starts. So it's built. It's the plots there are very difficult because they're built on quite steep hillsides. And so you gotta have all these different levels. And you know, there's a rich American, so obviously wanted, I think there's a pool somewhere, you know, basketball bit, whatever. So there's lots of bits and bobs. I don't think it's a fantastically beautiful house, really, but it looks quite livable. This is some later work that he did. This in Japan. He worked quite a bit in Japan. I think that's in the UK. That's also in Japan. That's probably his nicest building. It's a sort of like great hall for meetings and things in this university in Japan. He's got a couple of buildings very similar to this, and they were built for, one is a homeless shelter in California. And the thing that really struck me about it is that usually when people build something like a homeless shelter, I don't think they do it on purpose. I hope they don't do it on purpose. But it seems to communicate, you are really a marginal human being. And so we're going to house you into this kind of building because, you know, you're not in prison, but you're pretty close to it. And this building, you know, you may or may not like it, but it doesn't communicate that to me. You know, it communicates that, like, hey, look, you know, people like a bit of grass, nice windows, blah, 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 and, you know, you can have one too.
Scale.
Sorry?
Human scale.
It's human scale, there's repeated scales, there's lots of things that would meet this pattern. So that's it. That's Mr. Ali.
Any questions? Talkers have gone home. But, any questions? Yeah.
Yes. I don't have a question. I have some praise. I have some praise for you actually. One of the reasons I joined the club was to make friends and get educated. And I think tonight you've done something for me, which I've not been able to conclude. I walk around going abroad with him on seeing buildings and stuff. Is I've never been able to synthesize what all this means, and you've just done it for me.
What Christopher Alexander did.
Yeah.
Okay.
But thank you very much for this. The only thing I would ask, and I don't think it's been done before, is please can you send me the presentation?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Because I would just like to put all this together in the words. So thank you very much for doing the presentations. It synthesised all the things in my head. Now I know where the intellectual direction is that I can go in and have a look myself. Thank you.
I'm touched.
To be on a contrary point, Christopher Alexander has probably done the greatest damage to programming ever. Because Christopher Alexander was instrumental in the design patterns book, which was influenced heavily by him, which came up with what's called the singleton pattern, which I strive against to this day. And
can you tell me a bit more about that? Because
nightmare.
I've read that in IT, some people took some of his work and translated it into IT, but I don't know anything about it. So can you sort of explain a bit more what it is?
We might choose to take that offline because.
Okay. Sorry, maybe after the question.
We'll prepare other
Sorry.
things.
Yes.
To continue with my father's point of view, and just finish that off. He was involved in the as civil engineer, and in the early 60s, of course, there's a renaissance in neo-brutalism in London, and the idea is that they try to kick back on it with the Finsbury Park buildings and the ones along Victoria Street, Bridge Road, and they try to introduce the stepped approach to reflect on, for example, Roman amphitheatres or Greek buildings and Greek amphitheatres.
It also handles the light better.
Well, it was actually more an anti-theory. And they use brick rather than concrete to try and make it give it better texture and not give it the range stains that you get in the UK, a la National Theatre, which is actually meant to be pristine white, but they used a low-grade cement. And it's meant to look pristine white like Greek colonnades and so forth. But the big problem is what they found is the scale was dehumanizing, and what they found is massive violence.
I'm not a material determinist. You know, the Barbican is hyper brutalist, not just in the construction of the materials, but the layout, right? So you have this giant car tunnel, and then this very confusing system of walkways. I mean, it's really punishing design, but it works fine because it's full of people that are, you know, civil servants and city professionals and people like that.
Apart from the fact there is actually a serial killer in the Barbican.
Okay, but I mean, I don't think it's
And there
because,
have been a number, and the current serial killer is as yet unknown.
I don't think it's a Barbican that makes people kill people. I think that is like
People kill people, but
most of the very ugly buildings were inhabited by people that didn't have a choice, and on average, right? This is without justifying crime on the basis of social conditions, but on average, if you take a bunch of people that are comparatively less well off and comparatively less privileged, you will have, you know, more crime and vandalism than Chelsea.
People. The flats in there are very expensive.
Right, exactly.
Very privileged people.
The Barbican was never social housing. That's
No,
the
that's it.
assumption everybody
No,
has.
that's what I'm saying.
No,
That's what I'm-
no.
but that's what I'm saying. The Barbican has done fine for the people in it, even though it's brutalist. I don't,
Public housing, that's what it's built for.
But it's not, yeah,
That's
it's
they sold it
not,
off.
not social housing.
Yes, it was. It was sold for social
They
housing.
built
It was made
for
for social housing for us.
Corporation of London.
That's right, and they sold it off because it was where it was.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, are there any more questions about Christopher Alexander? Because I'll get a beer. After that, I'll get a beer.
I take issue with that because all of that is all very well and good. But
Equally as much as.
I lived on Haygate, right? And I lived in North Peckham and the Aylesbury estates, which are nightmares, okay? I was born in Deptford. They swept away all the nice houses to build shit, to build the stuff that architects thought that we deserved. And I have to tell you, I lived in Peckham in a damp-ridden rat hole, okay? And I was delighted when I moved to the Haygate, right? But very quickly, you suddenly realised what these places were. They were traps. You were stuck there like some sort of utopia. This is where you're going to live, this is where you're going to work, you're going to walk to work, you're going to have this. That's a bullshit. You don't want to live in a place like that. It's a fucking nightmare. Okay, and I was glad to get out of it. I'm glad I owned enough money to buy my way out of it. However, this guy, okay, it was all very well for you to say, oh, he looks a beautiful place, or he argued with him. But basically, he did nothing for the common man, did he? What did he do for me? What did he do aesthetically to the people who are basically earning 25 grand a year? Okay, can't afford to live in big houses in America, who can't afford to have pillars and columns and all that stuff. What they got nothing. When you talk about cannabis, the cannabis they had were walkways where you got robbed and mugged and raped. That's what you got, and that's what these people did. They put us in places where you're in jeopardy and it was dangerous. Nothing about what this man did, or any, like Norman Scott even, none of those did anything to help the normal person. All they did was help the people who could afford it. And they decided, this beautiful emphasis to do what? My granddad was one of the first people, when they redeveloped the Barbican, they built Roman House. My granddad worked for Arthur Anderson. He was one of the first people to work for him and became very famous in that company. Very wonderful stuff. However, he took a picture of the Barbican being built, and all you saw was blocks of offices, and that's what architects do. They build shit houses for people like me who earn less than 200 grand a year, okay? And they build offices which are functional, not aesthetically lovely, like the Romans did, or the people did in the Georgian times, where you had lovely flowing columns and all that stuff. Where are they? Nowhere. They're just flat, unsophisticated works of art which appeal to people like that. And as far as I'm concerned, that man and people like that are beyond contempt, because they did nothing for the working classes. And the working classes people kept that man in business. And that's a fact.
Sadly, it's the case. He showed me as the mosque. That's Roman. All mosques are based on Roman, impluvium, compluvium.
Greek.
And then
The Greeks, the Romans come with Greeks. Romans come with Greeks.
The Greeks, but the point is that's why you have the square and the open
Doric and
quadrangle.
Doric and Doric.
I would like to raise a point.
If we're talking
It's all
about
round actually.
unaesthetic doings, I think one of the most ugly things which is happening in Greater London are the
flat roofed extensions, which you see absolutely everywhere, which are absolutely ruining the London skyline. And these aren't done by architects or the upper classes, they're done by these sort of upper working class householders. So if you're talking about attacks on the aesthetic nature of London, I don't think we could have a more destructive example than the way that London's skyline has been built. But Are they built by the people? As Alexander was saying earlier on, those were the best examples.
Yeah,
They're
but
not built by
you have
architects,
to
they're
build-
built by builders.
You have to build flat roofs on the end of the terrace houses, the light. You can't build a pitch roof or any sort of roof behind the building. It has to be a flat so the people next door have got light. Otherwise, that will block the light out, and then you will never get any
Can't
planning
build
permission.
anything. I mean, people put these extensions because they think they're putting 30,000 on the value of their house.
No, that's not completely true, is it? You do it out of necessity. Because you can't build a house.
Our speaker has now run away, so I think that draws to a conclusion of our talk today. Thank you very much for watching.
One thing that I'm very interested in, thank you, one thing in here which reminds me of the writing of, I'm deliberately going to paraphrase, but it reminds me particularly of the writings of Ted Kaczynski, otherwise known as the Unabomber. In 9% Parking, section 22, we have suggested that the fabric of society is threatened by the mere existence of cars. I'm going to be getting a copy of this.